I titled what we're discussing this morning, Always Faith. Always Faith. We as children of God are called moment by moment and daily to live by faith. The subtitle is, You Never Outgrow Your Need to Trust Your Lord. You never outgrow your need to trust your Lord. As I was thinking about the challenge that faced Hezekiah and his need to exercise faith in a crisis point, my mind went back a number of years ago to around the time of 9/11, 2001, to a couple who were fulfilling their calling before the Lord as missionaries in the Philippines, Martin and Gracia Burnham. In September 1st, obviously, 2001, terrorists attacked the towers in New York City. But in May before that, terrorists kidnapped Gracia and Martin Burnham in the Philippines. Gracia and Martin had met at a Bible college in Kansas, and Martin was in pilot training to be a missionary pilot. They met and got to know each other and fell in love, and Gracia was more than willing to follow Martin's call to be a missionary pilot. They went to the Philippines, and Gracia says Martin was an excellent pilot. A doctor that he transported frequently said that Martin was the best missionary pilot that he knew. Gracia said, "We loved our ministry." He flew the plane and traveled and flew supplies and missionaries, and she handled the radio and ordered supplies and raised their 3 children that they had on the mission field. And then on a night in May, they actually substituted for another missions pilot to go to another island about 500 miles away from where they were based. And while they were there, it was the time of their 18th wedding anniversary. So they decided to take one day off during their duties there and went to a pretty modest, what they called on that island, resort to spend an overnight and celebrate their wedding anniversary. It was during that time in the early morning before they had awakened that there was banging on their door. And Martin thought maybe it was a drunken employee of the place that they were staying, but the pounding continued until the door broke open and men with guns, AK-16s I think, entered in and took them captive and just said, "Go, go, go." They took 20 captives. It turned out that these terrorists, these Muslim terrorists that were associated in some way with Osama bin Laden, were looking for a wealthy resort on that island where the wealthy people would come and stay, and they were going to capture some of them and hold them for ransom. They couldn't find that place, so they wound up raiding this place and took 20 people, including this missionary couple, captive. They spent 376 days in captivity in the jungle of the Philippines. They were always on the lookout for the Philippine soldiers who would come and try to free these captives. They were always on the move, sleeping out in the open, eating whatever they could find, sometimes uncooked rice, washing in often filthy water, sometimes with no food at all. The captives had one other American in the party, and just a few days into the captivity, they killed him in the particularly brutal way that the terrorists were doing. And during this time, Gracia and Martin thought about God's control, God's love for them, the plan that he had for their lives. Their 3 children were flown back to the United States. They were 11, 12, and 14 years old. Gracia says she remembers a roller coaster of emotions during this year and 11 days. Sometimes she would say, okay, God's going to get us out of this. People are praying, we know. But the next hour she'd think, we're never going to get out of here. We're going to die here. Her husband often buoyed her spirits. She said she was the weak one and her husband was the strong one. Sometimes just with a silly song, but often with promises of God. We were begging God, she said, that one of us could go home. We didn't want our kids to be orphans. Yet, as the year went on, they began to think that there was a likelihood that they were going to die in the jungle. Oftentimes, the military's mortars would land very close to them, and they knew their life was in danger. Gracia decided, after about a year, toward the end of their time there, to express to him what was on her heart. She said, I'm glad I married you. I wouldn't change that. I'm glad God gave us beautiful children. I'm glad we spent our lives doing something worthwhile. I'm glad we had a good marriage. Thank you for being a good husband. I'm officially saying goodbye to you in case the Lord didn't deliver them. During the 17th gun battle, Martin was shot in the chest and Gracia was shot in the leg. As she laid by him, she knew that he was dying. She was rescued. He died there in the Philippines, and she was reunited then with her children. And I will tell you a little bit more at the end about God's work in her life and in their lives. God called Martin and Gracia Burnham to serve him as missionaries, to serve him in the Philippines, to serve him in a place where the Muslims and Christians had bitter, ongoing battles, to serve him in a place where they were taken into captivity, to serve him in a place where one of their lives was taken. And God called them in the midst of all that to trust him in every circumstance and in every step of the way. The Burnhams are not like us in a number of ways, but they are like us. Their circumstance was extreme. But our circumstances call us to trust the Lord with all the things that occur in our lives, the things the Lord allows to come across our path, the things the Lord crafts to test us and try us and build us in our trust in him. Not a day goes by, but that you and I need to walk in trust and love for our great sovereign Lord and Savior. In Isaiah 36 and 37, we see Judah's king Hezekiah sorely in need of great faith in his great God. The nation is in crisis. The nation of Judah, the two tribes, are on the verge of extinction. And its leader feels a sense of responsibility and the tremendous, overwhelming power that faces them. As I have read about King Hezekiah in the past, I have often been greatly encouraged by this wonderful man of God. You don't have to turn to it, but in 2 Kings chapter 18, it says, in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the king of Israel, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord concerning all that his lineage father, David, had done. He removed the high places, the place of mixed pagan worship that the pagan nations had caused to syncretism in the worship of Israel. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah poles to the worship of female pagan deity. He broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among the kings of Judah after him. In 2 Chronicles 29, the chronicler adds this: in the 1st year of his reign, in the 1st month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east. He said to them, "Hear me, Levites, now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him and have turned away their faces from the habitation of the Lord and turned their backs." They did this in great measure because of his father, King Ahaz. It says that Ahaz turned away from following the Lord and encouraged this pagan worship among them. And it even says about Ahaz that he led his children through the fire. Pagan sacrifice of people. And Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, did that. The Lord was judging Judah because of their sins, because of Hezekiah's father. But somehow in the grace of God, God raised up this man, Hezekiah. And I'm so encouraged when I think that a godly man springs up in the midst of an ungodly, half-hearted faith environment. But Hezekiah's faith, it seems, as we get to the scriptures in Isaiah 36 and 37, had begun to drift. His father Ahaz had formed an alliance with Assyria. The kings in those days, the smaller kings, continually formed alliances to try to shore up their strength against one another. But Hezekiah chose to form an alliance with the ungodly nation of Assyria. Hezekiah, as Kenny described for us last week in his description of the threats that Israel was facing, formed an alliance with Egypt. Let's see, I remember Egypt. Egypt was the one who held God's people in slavery, who caused them to make bricks, and if they rebelled, they added to their weight, and the Lord freed them from Egypt. But Hezekiah, fearing the nation of Assyria, made an alliance with Egypt. A godly man, drifting, it seems, in his faith. And it reminds me that it's so easy for us to begin to trust God's blessings in our lives, the gifts that He's given to us, our ability to know how to accomplish great work in the place that God has called us, our intellect, our planning abilities, the talents that He's given to us. And as we find ourselves in the spheres where we operate, it is easy for us to begin to trust, without even realizing it, primarily in our abilities to work things out. But God turns us from our self-sufficiency and turns us back to placing our wholehearted trust in Him. And often He does it in our lives as a result of a crisis. The Lord brought crisis to the nation of Israel, certainly because of judgment, but certainly as well, these were His people whom He loved, whom He had made a covenant bond with, and He desired to turn them back to love and trust in Him. So look again at Isaiah 37, and I'll retrace a little bit of what Kenny talked about last week. And in 37:1, as soon as King Hezekiah read it, so the proclamation that had sent to him about what Sennacherib was going to do to them, he read it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. Hezekiah was overwhelmed with the danger and the imposing reality of the destruction of the nation of Israel. I wonder if we understand and feel the depth of Hezekiah's despair. 20 years before, in 721, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel had been totally conquered by the king of Assyria. This same king was at Hezekiah's doorstep, his army, at least. In the annals of Assyria, they record that before the siege of Jerusalem, 46 cities of Judah had fallen to the king of Assyria. And Hezekiah began to realize that it was partly because of his at least somewhat eroded faith that this trouble was before them. In 37:1, it says that he tore his clothes, he covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. And it's interesting, as he went into the house of the Lord, it doesn't say in this place what he did, except that he sent people to Isaiah. Look at verse 4. And he said, "Tell Isaiah, maybe that the Lord your God, Isaiah, it may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words of the Lord your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant who is left. Hezekiah knew how to pray. He had trusted the Lord to do what was right and take initiative. But I just wonder about his heart and his condition. He knew to go to the temple of the Lord, but he turned to Isaiah to pray to his God. Let's read as Harv read in 5 and the verses that follow. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." Then the Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, for he had heard that the king had left Lachish. And now the king, Sennacherib, heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, another name for the king of Egypt. He has set out to fight against you. So the attention of Sennacherib, the great king as he was called and saw himself, his attention was directed to fighting these other smaller kingdoms, and the king of Egypt had arisen again. But in the middle of that verse, verse 9, he has set out to fight against you. And when he had heard it, what did he do? He re-upped the pressure on Hezekiah. He sent messengers to Hezekiah with words directly from himself. "Thus you shall speak to Hezekiah, the king of Judah. Do not let your God in whom you trust." Maybe he had heard Hezekiah's response, and maybe that Hezekiah was trusting in the Lord. And now instead of telling the people, "Don't let Hezekiah deceive you," Sennacherib is saying, "Don't let your God deceive you. You will not be delivered from us," by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. "Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, devoting them to destruction. Shall you be delivered?" Now Isaiah had already promised and encouraged him, even from things he has said all along in the book of Isaiah, "Do not be afraid." But the heat was being turned up on Hezekiah. And in verse 14, these simple words in 14 and 15. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. Now it was Sennacherib himself. Now it was Hezekiah himself. And now it was God himself before Hezekiah. All of us in our lives, at some time or another, have known times of a crushing sense of fear or worry. It may have been only momentary, or it may have been extended periods of time. I think of people in the present whom I know among us and others who are going through some things that just feel so overwhelming. As we think of the Burnhams and their time in the Philippine jungles and what was going to happen to them, what do we do in those times in our life personally when fear grips us, when worry seems to invade our lives over an extended period of time, sometimes when things are just almost unbelievable? It's the same thing that we do with the things that seem smaller in our lives. Our God is the same God in the smaller things that we need to trust Him for, in the huge things that we need to trust Him for. I think when one of our children was 12 years old, we were living in Greeley, Colorado at the time, and one of our daughters had something that my wife felt she needed to take her to the doctor for. And our 12-year-old had awakened earlier and could barely speak. And Jeannie thought that maybe he had laryngitis, and he went back to sleep. But it was time to take our daughter in, and Jeannie thought she would take our son in as well. And they got into the doctor's office, and the doctor looked at the two children and said, "I want to see him first." And so she took him in. The doctor took him in, and he was not able to speak very well, and the doctor realized he was not able to breathe very well. And they have this little clear plastic tube that has a little lever that goes back up and down if you blow into it to test your breath, and he couldn't even move the lever. So the doctor said, "I don't want to alarm you, but I want you to take him right across the street to the hospital. They have a wheelchair, and they'll take him in." They realized that he had an acute asthmatic attack, and he could barely get any breath. We hadn't even realized that he was the one that needed to go into the doctor's office. I think on a personal level and even on a leadership level, I remember in one of the two, I'll try to make this subtle, one of the two previous churches at which I served, there was a man who went from our church on a sort of self-directed mission trip to a missionary that our church supported. And it happened to be a fellow that I knew who had been a layman and then had been called into the mission. And this person went down to be a part of their ministry down there. And when he went down there, he launched into a discussion with this missionary about how I wasn't a very good pastor. And in leading the church, that I assume he listed a number of ways that he saw my inadequacy. And that's not very encouraging for a pastor of someone in his church to say to a missionary. But I don't know if he realized that this missionary was a good friend of mine. And I heard back from him. And I thought at that point in time, what am I going to do with this? I could have taken it to the elder board and said, this guy needs to be corrected. This is what's going on. I decided not to do anything with it except turn it over to the Lord. I remember another time there had been something sort of similar, and I remember getting out a little journal that I used from time to time and writing in my journal about God who protects our reputations. My reputation is not mine to guard as God's servant. My reputation can be entrusted back to the God whom I serve. And so all of us at different times in our lives understand the need to deliberately trust the Lord our God. So reading further in Isaiah 37, Hezekiah prayed to the Lord. And as I think about this passage in this prayer, knowing what Hezekiah was going through, it's just exhilarating to me. Let's read it together and look at it. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. He starts out with an acclamation in this overwhelming pressure he's facing, that you are God. You are the Lord of hosts. And what host means primarily is an assembly of armies. Here's the army of Assyria assembling around Jerusalem, and he said, Lord, you are the Lord of hosts. You not only control the armies of the world, but you control the armies of heaven. Can you catch the faith that Hezekiah is exhibiting in the face of this threat? The Lord of hosts and the God of Israel. You are our personal God. And I wonder what we would say if this were our prayer. Oh Lord, you love your people. You are the Almighty One. God, you are the majestic one. You're limitless in your power. You've committed yourself in a bond of faithfulness to your people. There's nothing that you can't do. I wonder, in the midst of our difficulties and trials, how often we pull back, Sennacherib alone, Hezekiah alone, God alone, and say, God, you are awesome. You are wonderful to me. I exalt you. I remember the wonder of who you are. And then he says, incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. And hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Psalm 86 is a similar psalm to this. And it starts with this word, incline your ear, O God. And the root of this Hebrew word has the association of bending down or bowing down. And I think of our grandkids sometimes who are talking to us, and sometimes they say things in not a very clear way. And sometimes we might listen to our younger ones like this. I go to my dad's place, and sometimes he doesn't speak very loudly, and I think of cupping my ear. But the idea, in a sense, is bowing down or bending down to hear the prayer. And it's like a father or mother and a child. And Hezekiah is saying, God, can you bend over and listen? Can you see? Can you hear what's going on? Lord, they're mocking you. And I am living for your honor. And that, he says in verse 16, in verse 18, truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. And he said, Lord, as I think about it, Assyria truly is the most powerful force that I can imagine. They've destroyed everybody in their path. but they didn't believe in the one true God. And I do. And then he says, finally, so now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. Will we so trust the Lord our God in the circumstances of our lives that people will see him through us? Will people see the mighty work of God, not just to deliver us, but in our hearts and in our lives, and how we respond to the circumstances around us? Gracia Burnham said this: I learned to trust God in a whole new way. And she said that she is not bitter. She said, Martin used to tell me, Gracia, if and when you get out of here, your kids are going to need their mother back. They don't need a bitter mother. God is going to work this out for good. She has found some of her former captors. 23 of them are in maximum security in Manila. She has begun correspondence with some of them. She began an organization, a foundation to reach Muslims in the Philippines. And 4 of them have come to know Christ as their Savior. Today, Gracia's youngest son, Zach, studies at Calvary Bible School in Kansas City, the same school where his parents met and married. Her oldest son, Jeff, is a missionary pilot. Just like his dad. His daughter, Mindy, married a New Tribes missionary, just like Gracia. She said, yes, we'd been begging God to let one of us come home and raise our kids. And isn't it funny that the one God chose was the weak one? But God often uses weak things. This was written a few years ago, and she said, Martin died 10 years ago. I'm surprised that people keep asking me to speak, but they do. They meet me and see that I'm a normal person. I'm not big, and I'm not strong. That's the good part of the story. I am just like you, but God can do anything and use anybody. Will we trust the Lord our God so that people would see the living God through our lives?